All right, we're talking about phenomenology. And we said that the key is that whereas in Aristotelian philosophy, the object, no, sorry, I saw that already. No, we're on Brentano, that's right. Brentano has often been described as an extraordinarily charismatic teacher. Throughout his life, he influenced a great number of students, many of whom became important philosophers. And we talked about all those people. Many of his students became professors all over the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Marti in Prague, Meinong, who we'll see shortly, in Graz, and I'm going to say Twardowski in Lvov, which in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was Lemberg, but passed to Ukraine after World War I. And so spread Brentanianism over the whole Austro-Hungarian Empire. Another of Brentano's students, Thomas Masaryk, is that Masaryk or Masaryk? Well, that's interesting because right next to Brooksville there's a Masaryk town, and that was settled by Czechs who came from Czechoslovakia. First they went to New York, but then they decided that they would go to Florida and grow something in Florida. I think they must have been disappointed because nothing grows in Florida. And because he was the head of Czechoslovakia, I think he was a socialist, before the war, like during the 20s or 30s, I think around then, they called it Masaryk town. And if you go over there, you can see streets with Czech names. So anyway, that's a little footnote for you. Who would have thought that in some rural place in Florida you would find Czech, immigrants, but they came here. So Thomas Masaryk, who was to become founder and first president from 1918 to 1935. He got ousted in 1935 by a certain, what was that, Tissot, right? Tissot, yes. Of the Republic of Czechoslovakia, where he created ideal conditions for the study of Brentano's philosophy. I'm almost certain he was a socialist. These factors explain the central role of Brentano in the philosophical development in Middle Europe, especially in what was later called the Austrian tradition in philosophy. This is all from some encyclopedia of philosophy. Brentano also emphasized that he meant to teach his students to think critically in a scientific manner without holding prejudices and paying undue respect to philosophical schools or traditions. When former students of his took a critical approach to his own work, however, when they criticized some of his doctrines and modified others to adopt them for their own goals, Brentano reacted bitterly. That's so typical. So typical. He often refused to discuss criticism, ignored improvements, and thus became more and more isolated, a development that was reinforced by his increasing blindness, physical blindness. Due to these eye problems, Brentano could not read or write any longer, but had his wife read to him and dictated his work to her. Nonetheless, he produced a number of books in his years in Florence. In 1907, he published Untersuchungen zur Sinnespsychologie, which is researches on meaning psychology. The Sinn, Sinn is meaning, I think, right? Sinn? The Sinn? Sense, yes. Yes, sense, yes. Yes. A collection of shorter texts on psychology. In 1911, he presented not only the second volume of his Psychology from an empirical standpoint, but also two books on Aristotle. In Aristotle and His Worldview, he provides an outline and interpretation of Aristotle's philosophy. In Aristoteles' Lehre vom Ursprung des menschlichen Geistes, Aristotle's teaching on the origin of the human mind, Brentano continues a debate with Scheler This debate had started already in the 1860s when Brentano criticized Zeller's interpretation of Aristotle in his Psychology of Aristotle, and became quite intense and aggressive in the 70s and 80s of the 19th century. So this is not terribly important. This is just for your edification and delight. You should know something about these people. When Italy entered the war against Germany and Austria during World War I, Brentano, who felt himself a citizen of all three countries, moved from Florence to neutral Switzerland. He passed away in Zurich on March 17th, 1917. So, Brentano left a number of unpublished manuscripts on a wide range of philosophical topics. After his death, Alfred Castile and Oskar Kraus, who were students of Brentano's former student Anton Marti in Prague, began to publish posthumously lecture notes, letters, and drafts he had left. They tried to present Brentano's work as best as they could, putting together various texts to what they thought were rounded, convincing works, sometimes following questionable editorial criteria. Their work was continued by other more careful editors, but has not been completed yet. Moreover, a much-needed critical edition of his complete works is still to be waited for, and that's from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, all of that. Brentano, in 1874, published a book on psychology in which he developed his theory of intentionality. He says that consciousness is always conscious of something, that is, it is intentional, it intends an object. He concludes that one can study the object as intended, that is, the object as the mind conceives it, apart from its extramental nature or status. So it's the same old junk. You see, that the mind is not made for the outside thing, or your mind is not merely like a camera which takes the object in and reproduces it, but rather in some way enhances the object or changes the object according to your experience. Same old garbage. Who's missing there? Somebody missing? Or nobody wants to sit next to you, is that it? Okay. I can understand that. The consciousness is merely, the modern philosophers just love consciousness. Consciousness is merely your mind's knowledge of its own activity. So you are, this is in the scholastic sense. So there's an object, and your mind perceives the object. So there's perception, concept. And then behind that, there is your mind looking at its own consciousness. Looking at its own activity. That's consciousness. That's why certain things can be done unconsciously. That is, if you do things very fast, if you jump from a fire, or you do things without thinking, where there's no ability to watch what is going on. But that's all consciousness is. It's not any sort of, they extol, all the modern philosophers extol consciousness as some sort of, how would you say, the ultimate in human thought. And it isn't. It's just taking pictures of its own activity. So you're conscious of what you're doing. See, so if you're half asleep, you're only half conscious of what you're doing. But that consciousness is necessary for rational behavior. See, so if you were completely blind drunk, you can say, well, I did it without any consciousness of what I was doing. So you're incapable of sin at that point, even though you committed a mortal sin by drinking so much to make yourself essentially unconscious. You'll do that in moral theology. But that's, yes.
There a difference between the consciousness of reflecting on one's action and one's knowledge?
Yes, you see, in French, conscience is the same for both. Moral conscience in English is a judgment of the intellect. About to do something. In other words, on the point of doing something. Of something you're about to do, I should say. In other words, should I have a 10th glass of wine? You see? And you're deciding the morality of that act. That's conscience. Moral conscience is not a faculty. It's not where you have some sort of faculty of deciding, where you know the law and you use your conscience. It is merely applying the law to something that you are about to do. So of itself, it's blind. It receives the law. See, so using your conscience, and you'll do this in moral theology, the simply means to apply the law as you know it to what you are about to do. It's a judgment. This is moral, it is immoral. All right? So, but a lot of moderns, would say, well, your conscience is some sort of dictator of the law. It is not. Freedom of conscience. It has no freedom in the sense that it is not free from the law of God. Yes?
So forming a conscience, what you spoke about, would be the understanding the law better?
Reading a moral theology book is forming your conscience. Now, it has to, in certain cases, you may not know the law, or you may be doubtful of the application of the law. See, but it's really just a judgment of your intellect. It's not some sort of special faculty, like the will and the intellect are special faculties. It's just part of the intellect. All right? Then consciousness in English is what I just described here, what we might call psychological consciousness, or conscience psychologique. Consciousness is this knowledge of the activity of the intellect and of the will, just your knowledge of what you're doing. Oh, you have a question? Yes.
Yes, Excellency. I want to ask about human beings who are with Down syndrome. How do we examine them with regard to things and their actions with regard to things?
There's one word I missed. What? Down syndrome. Okay. It depends on the level of the Down syndrome. That is, some people have it worse than others, but I would say probably they are incapable of mortal sin because of their simplicity and their incapability of reasoning properly. I would say probably, but I'm no expert on Down syndrome. And there's different levels. Some are much more impaired than others. But the principle is there that if you are mentally impaired, retarded, whatever, that it definitely could affect your morality, in other words, your ability to make a moral judgment, and therefore easily dispense you from the ability to commit a mortal sin. That's just a general principle. Yeah. Each case would be different. So, Brentano will influence Karl Stumpf, right, who had Edmund Husserl, who's very important. As one of his pupils, Husserl is considered to be the founder of the school of phenomenology. So he's the Aquinas of phenomenology, Husserl. See, that's why Brentano is important, not so much as a major figure himself, but in his influence. Meinong, he's minor. Alexius Meinong was born in Lemberg, Austria, now Lviv in Ukraine, and died in Graz, Austria. He studied at the academic gymnasium. Now you have to understand that a gymnasium in German-speaking countries is not a place where you play basketball. All right, it is it's like an advanced high school, right? If I'm not mistaken, yeah. It's like for better students, you go to the gymnasium, right? Why they call it a gymnasium, I have no idea, but they call it a gymnasium. All right, Vienna, and later the University of Vienna, where he read history and philosophy as a pupil of Franz Brentano. He was professor and chair of philosophy at the University of Graz, that's in Austria, where he founded the Graz Psychological Institute in 1894. So you see, psychology is really getting to be the thing at this time. And the Graz School of Experimental Psychology. Meinong supervised the promotion of Christian von Ehrenfels, founder of Gestalt, which means form in German, Gestalt psychology, as well as the habilitation of Alois Höfler and Anton Oehlselt, that's German, Navin, okay. Alexius Meinong studied under Brentano in Vienna. He distinguished two types of objects: one, particular things such as trees, stones, etc., and two, objects of consciousness which are present to consciousness even if they do not exist outside the mind, which is possible, like a gold mountain. Meinong's theory aided in the development of objects as they are objects of consciousness. So again, the same old line of consciousness producing reality. Husserl, 1859 to 1938. Edmund Gustav Albrecht Husserl was a German philosopher known as the father of phenomenology. Husserl was born into a Jewish family in Prosnitz, Moravia, Czech Republic, then part of the Austrian Empire. Moravia sits in between the Czech part of that country, well, what was that country, and the Slovak part. And so you have basically a long country which has one, like a fat end on it, and then it gets thinner as it goes this way. This is Prague, and this is where the Czechs live. And then the Slovaks are over here. And then in between you have Moravia, which sort of got eaten in the whole process. Right? So they ended up in one big... Czechoslovakia was, from the beginning, a crazy thing to do. I mean, to make one country out of people who really didn't like each other too much. So... and differed in religion and various other things. So anyway, so they broke it up, with the after the fall of the Soviet Union, or They broke it up into, it's now, they first said Czech Republic, now it's Czechia. And then Slovakia, right? Slovakia, yes. Bratislava being the capital, right? Yes. And Prague, the capital of Czechia. Right? And it was one of the prizes that Hitler wanted because of the Skoda munitions factory in Prague, so for building guns. So he had his eyes on Czechoslovakia. So, and he had this, because of Wilson's wisdom. What is the Sudetenland? They gave Czechoslovakia in 1919 to part of what is rightfully Germany by blood and people. A strip of land, big strip though, to Czechoslovakia. So these Germans were constantly complaining that we're part of Czechoslovakia. We don't want to be part of Czechoslovakia. And, suppose you were given to Mexico. Suppose they broke off some of, Arizona or something and gave it to Mexico. You say, we don't want to be Mexican. We want to be Americans. Well, maybe they do want to be Mexican, but maybe they are already Mexicans. But I'm saying that, or if we were given away to Canada or something like that, or Cuba, if Florida was given to Cuba, well, yeah, I mean, here you are, you're German, you've been German, all your family was German for 1,000 years or something, and then all of a sudden you're being ruled by Czechs, and that's a very sensitive thing in Europe where there's all these peoples, and so they, would like to go back to Germany. So of course Hitler saw that as a perfect excuse. So first he invaded the Sudetenland, and that's the famous Munich conference of 1938, where they, I think it was in the fall of 38, where they made peace because the England and France and somebody else I forgot. Were objecting to Hitler's taking of the Sudetenland. And so they had this conference in Munich, and that was the famous place where they settled all of their troubles. And Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister of England, came back with a piece of paper with Hitler's signature on it. Peace in our times. See, there was threat of war already. Peace in our times. And so that's very famous. He gets off the plane and holds up the, peace in our times. And Hitler said, when he invaded Poland, he said, they won't do anything. I saw them at Munich. That's what he said. They're cowards. They won't do anything. Meaning France and England. Well, they did something. So that's how it all started. The ironic thing is that England was in the position to do nothing for Poland. Nothing, because how do you invade Poland from England? Or it's. And then after the war, they handed over Poland to the Soviet Union, which the whole purpose of the war was to protect Poland from being overrun by Germany and the Soviet Union. Mostly Germany. Because the Soviet Union had not yet rolled into Poland at that time. The Germans attacked Poland. And so out of outrage, they had to protect Poland. And then at the end, there was supposed to be a plebiscite in Poland. And, Polish had fought with the English against the Germans. They had a whole, especially in the Air Force. So they were fighting with the Allies against the Germans. And then at a meeting with Stalin, Churchill just gave the whole thing away to the Soviet Union. Stalin said, well, yes, there will be a plebiscite. Yeah. No, it was awful. It's just awful. So the whole purpose of the war was thwarted. Anyway, it's neither here nor there. I'm out of my sphere of influence here. So, how do we go? Moravia, okay. A pupil of Franz Brentano and Karl Stumpf, Husserl came to influence, among others, Edith Stein, who was a Jewish convert to Catholicism, and she became Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, and she was canonized by JP2. Eugen Fink, Martin Heidegger, who will be very prominent in later on, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. He's another existentialist. So he's very, very influential in later philosophers. Hermann Weil's interest in intuitionistic logic and impredictivity appear to have resulted from contacts with Husserl. In 1887, he converted to Christianity and joined the Lutheran Church. That was typical for Jews in the 19th century Germany because you would be more accepted in society if you were Lutheran instead of Jewish. He taught philosophy at Halle as a tutor, Privatdozent, from 1887, and then at Göttingen as professor from 1901, and then at Freiburg im Breisgau, that's in southwest Germany near France, from 1916 until he retired in 1928. Following his retirement, he continued his research by writing by using the library at Freiburg until barred therefrom because of his Jewish heritage under the rectorship of his former pupil and intended protégé, Martin Heidegger. Martin Heidegger was very, very tight with the Third Reich. We'll see. Husserl attended Brentano's lectures in Vienna. He became professor of philosophy at Göttingen and then in Freiburg im Breisgau, where he had Martin Heidegger as a student. Husserl distinguished between two types of consciousness, one as a complex of psychical facts, events, and experiences. Two, as objects of consciousness which are meant or intended. These latter are phenomena to the former. The former, however, are lived and experienced. Hence, we see the recurring theme of phenomenology, that there is a difference between objectivist truths and lived truths, and that the object as lived or experienced is different from the object as merely defined. In other words, Husserl established the difference between meaning and things. Very important. See, meaning and things in scholastic philosophy is the same, just as the picture in your camera is the same as the object. It just has a different kind of existence, that's all. But the content is exactly the same. But here you have, thing and meaning are two different things. Two different meanings. Husserl calls the act of consciousness noesis and its correlative object, which is meant or intended, as noema. Husserl insists on a suspension of judgment with regard to the ontological or existential status or reference of the objects of consciousness. So we don't decide whether they exist or not in reality, whether this really exists. We just suspend our judgment about it. So as I bang my head against the wall, I'll suspend my judgment about whether the wall exists or not. Okay? I mean, it sounds like a bad dream. If you woke up from a dream of people saying these things, you'd say, oh, that was like a nightmare. But this is what operates the whole world. This means that the object of our intellect is not the object as it exists outside the mind, but rather our experience of the object. Again, Kantianism. That the object of your intellect is your own production. Copleston says, but in point of fact, Husserl proceeds to make the transition to idealism by trying to deduce consciousness from the transcendental ego and by making the reality of the world relative to consciousness. That's what I just said. Hence, the object must be constituted by consciousness. So you don't attain an object with your knowledge, you attain a consciousness of something with your knowledge. All right. This fundamental tenet of phenomenology, that nothing can be conceived except as an object of consciousness, and that the object must be constituted by consciousness, will have a profound influence upon 20th century philosophy. Prominent followers of Husserl on this point are Max Scheler, much admired by John Paul II. He was John Paul II's hero, Max Scheler. Jean-Paul Sartre, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, both existentialists, and the so-called transcendental Thomists, Lonergan, Rahner, Lotz, I think it's Lutz, Corret, and the school of Joseph Maréchal in general. So that all of this thinking is going to invade a Thomist school. So Max Scheler, 1874 to 1928. Max Scheler was born in Munich in 1874. His father was Lutheran and his mother was Orthodox Jewish. He converted to Catholicism in his youth. Around 1921, however, he became increasingly non-committal, and in 1922 he publicly repudiated the Catholic faith. So he's an apostate. He studied medicine, philosophy, and sociology at the university. He received his doctorate in 1897. He taught at Jena, which is the pit of the German universities, from 1900 to 1906. In 1901, he came in contact with Husserl, with whom he would collaborate a great deal. From 1907 to 1910, he taught at the University of Munich. There he joined the Phenomenological circle, which included, among others, Dietrich von Hildebrand. He was a famous traditionalist. I used to go to his lectures in the 1960s. But he was a phenomenologist. I knew something was wrong when he was introduced as the greatest philosopher since St. Augustine. There's somebody missing there. I'll never forget that. He had sort of an altar boy by the name of William Mara, who would introduce Dietrich von Hildebrand. Von Hildebrand was ancient by that time. You know, he looked like, or at least he looked ancient. And he would come in with the long hair and the typical old professor type. And he had a very strong German accent. And he would talk like this, and he would say all of these things. He talked very slowly, and so he was sort of a figure, and this venerable figure, and he was just worshipped by this Fordham, that was Fordham University, a Jesuit university in New York, worshipped by William Mara. So William Mara gets up. I'm sitting there. I was still in the modern, 68. I was like 18, 19, I knew something, though. And he gets up and says, Dietrich von Hildebrand is the greatest philosopher since St. Augustine. I'll never forget that he said that. I mean, this goes back a long, long time. And So I knew that, whatever good was in Hildebrand. Hildebrand was criticizing the New Liturgy a lot. He wrote a book on it, actually. There's some, I think we have them in the library. And he said a lot of very good things, but he had no use for St. Thomas and scholasticism. And his big hero was St. Augustine. But I mean, that's just an absurd thing to say. The greatest philosopher since St. Augustine. That would be like, how would you? First of all, St. Augustine only dabbled in philosophy. I mean, he talked about philosophy occasionally, but his main concern was theology and spirituality. And but he did not have any systematic philosophical system. Well, that's redundant. But in other words, he was not ex professo a philosopher as St. Thomas was. St. Thomas commented all of the works of Aristotle. So I mean to say, anyway, Dietrich von Hildebrand. He became involved with the socialist media as well. That's Husserl, Scheler. Later, he lectured at the Philosophical Society of Göttingen, where Edith Stein was one of his students. So you see, this is all a club. He divorced his wife in 1912 and remarried. So he's still a Catholic in 1912. In 1919, he became professor of philosophy and sociology at the University of Cologne. In 1923, he came in contact with the Russian emigre Berdyaev in Berlin. He favored pacifism and the United States of Europe. That means he was a leftist. If you were favoring the United States of Europe, which was a fad in the 1920s, you were a leftist. Needless to say, his works were banned under the Third Reich for all sorts of reasons. Scheler is important particularly because his ideas caught the interest of the young Karol Wojtyła. Wojtyła was born, I think, in 1922 or 1920 or somewhere around there. Later, John Paul II, who did his doctoral thesis on Scheler's ideas and wrote many articles on his philosophy. So you can see what kind of mind Wojtyła had. This is the doctoral thesis that Garrigou rejected. No? Yes?
Was he subsequently approved for his thesis?
I don't know. I just know that Garrigou rejected his thesis, doctoral thesis. Maybe he got it approved by somebody else. But Garrigou wouldn't approve it. But Scheler was the, imagine, and this is the Wojtyła who learned German in order to read Immanuel Kant. I mean, it's good to learn German, but not to read Immanuel Kant. There's a lot of other interesting things in German besides Immanuel Kant. Scheler's philosophy was in reaction to Hegel, Husserl, and Kant. For him, the human heart accounts for the essence of human existence, which is ridiculous. There is no such thing as the human heart. Yeah, physically there is. It pumps blood. But there's no such thing as... it's just a term that refers to emotions, like a conglomerate of the emotions. That's the human heart. Sometimes it refers to our will, where your heart is, and etc. It's your will. But there's no separate faculty or something that is known as the heart. It's what you're interested in. It's where your treasure is. The human person, he says, is fundamentally a loving being. Feelings and love have a logic of their own quite different from the logic of reason. It's a lot of garbage. That means, if you love, somebody other than your wife, that has a logic all its own, and you can dump your wife and marry the other woman. It's because love has its own logic. He says that there are 5 value ranks feelable by all humans. They are felt in variable body feelings, feelings of needs, feelings of life, and feelings of the person of the divine. So there's your modernism. Feeling values are comparable to seeing colors, just as colors are independent of the things they are on. Blue can be the sky or a cloth. So values are independent of the things they are felt with. The value of holiness, for instance, can be experienced with God, but also with a fetish, or with Mother Earth, as in the American Indian cultures, the Pachamama. It's true. I mean, here it is. This is what has guided John Paul II, the supposed Pope, from 1978 to 2005. This is the kind of thinking. There it is, ecumenism. So you can experience God with a fetish. There's one of these pagan, things. Or the Pachamama, Mother Earth. Scheler's philosophy of religion suggests that the absolute is given in a sphere or region of our mind that offers 2 alternatives. 1, it is either filled out with faith in God, or 2, with belief in idols. Don't forget, JP2, when he was in Africa, threw some vegetables or something, threw something into a tent where there was the sacred snake. I don't know if you know that. There was some sort of sacred snake that the locals were worshiping in the tent, and he threw something at the snake in order to feed it, or some sort of offering to the snake. That's all. It's right there. He participated in every false religion, I think, on the face of the earth. Did something, some kind of worship, with every false religion on the face of the earth. And when he was in Polynesia, he drank the potion, which was like a sex potion. I don't know if you know that. It's supposed to increase your sexuality. So he drank down. It's a picture of him with one of these wooden cups, or these cups made out of coconut or something, which has a religious thing. And then that it was either under Ratzinger or JP2 that they approved the hula at Mass in Hawaii, this business. And that has sexual overtones too. It's because it was like connected with their religion. The hula in Hawaii, it's like a sex religion. Yeah. Scheler denies the notion of a creator God. Deity, man, and the world form one becoming process of unification taking place in absolute time. As yet, this unification is unfinished. I think we're getting there, though. Right? Scheler makes many references to Buddha, as did JP2. All right. Yes. Wojtyła. Yes, he went to the Angelicum. So he knew all the scholastic philosophy and theology. Having Garrigou for a teacher, you couldn't do any better in the whole world than having Garrigou for a philosophy and theology teacher. So he knew. And he rejected all of that. He was a monster. He was the Napoleon of the revolution. Napoleon spread all of the ideas of the revolution all over Europe, and also altered government and social aspects of Europe according to the revolution. And the revolution possibly could have been more confined to France if Napoleon had not existed. And so also Paul VI was the sort of the Robespierre of the revolution, whereas John Paul was the Napoleon of the revolution. All right, that's our time. I think we'll quit there today.